Ingogo, South Africa, 1881. You have fought in many battles, but none quite like this one. A bullet ricochets close by as you struggle to get the cannon ready to fire again. The Boers are meant to be afraid of artillery, but instead they are peppering you with lethally accurate fire, popping up from behind rocks to deal out death. As a fellow gunner tries to sponge the cannon's barrel, a bullet smashes into his leg. He tries to rise, but a second, and then a third, finish him off. You complete the task, somehow avoiding the bullets. Captain Greer runs over yelling, "What's taking so long?" and grabs the fuse from the shaking hands of an artilleryman. He's about to insert it in the vent when a bullet glances off the gun, killing him on the spot. Another steps forward and finally fires the cannon as the Boers disappear behind their rocks. You really doubt that any Boers have been hit. As you start prepping the cannon to fire, the bullets start up again. And you feel one nick your cheek, barely missing your head. If this keeps up, soon there'll be no gunners left. How did Collie get you into this mess? I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In our last episode, we covered the Boers of the Transvaal rebelling against the British, inflicting a bloody defeat on the Redcoats at the Battle of Bronkhorstspruit. Now, the remaining British garrisons in the Transvaal are under siege. It's up to the wunderkind of the British Army, General Colley, to save the day. When the news of the disaster at Bronkhorstspruit reached Britain, it stunned and dismayed the nation. All the reports sent back to London by Lyndon had claimed the Boers were an undisciplined mob that would not fight. Reinforcements were to be rushed in from India and the home islands, but this would take time, and there was no guarantee that the besieged garrisons would hold out that long. However, the British were still confident that they held the upper hand. The disaster at Bronkhorstspruit was blamed solely on the conveniently dead Anstruther. To be fair, there was a lot of truth in this. The British seemed to have many advantages. While the Boers were better individual marksmen, the Redcoats could combine and synchronise their firepower to devastating effect. Their artillery was particularly feared by the Boers. When if it came to close-quarter combat, the bayonets of the British would be lethal. There was just one problem. Would the Boers allow the British to fight the kind of war they wanted to fight? The victory at Bronkhorstspruit had an electrifying effect on the Boers. Those who had been on the fence, claiming the British couldn't be beaten, now threw in their lot with the rebel army. Boers from the Orange Free State and even British-controlled South Africa flocked to join the cause. Apart from those besieging the British garrisons, the majority of the Boer army, about 2,000 men in total, crossed the border into Natal, where they fortified themselves at a low-lying 6-mile-long spur of the Drakensberg Mountains that blocked the way from Natal into the Transvaal. The only way to reach the Transvaal was to take the Newcastle Road through Laings Nek Pass, and it was at the neck that the Boers would make their stand. If the British tried to approach, they would effectively be funneled straight into the waiting guns of the Boers. A perfect killing zone. It was a formidable defensive position, one that the British should have fortified years ago. However, overconfidence meant it had been left wide open for the Boers to seize. Against this, Colley could only rustle up 1,462 men, 6 field guns, 2 Gatling guns, and 3 24-pound rocket tubes. Military doctrine says you need at least a 3-to-1 advantage in men to take a fortified position. Colley was actually outnumbered. Ryder Haggard travelled to his camp to warn him that his small force would be decimated if he attacked the neck, that he needed more men. He would later say that, quote, "Nobody dreamed he meant to attack the neck with such an insignificant column," end quote. Yet despite the warnings and his own strategic brilliance, this is exactly what Colley was planning to do. Why? Firstly, the British still had little but disdain for the Boers, with the rank and file calling the rebels pinheads. Historian Joseph H. Lehman explains their attitude well. The Boers were considered a primitive enemy, one which had barely attained that level of civilization which could avail itself of the advantage of modern rifles. It was with this attitude in mind that Colley issued a particularly insulting and arrogant ultimatum to the Boer commander at Laings Nek, Piet Joubert, quote, "The men who follow you are, many of them, ignorant, and know and understand a little of anything outside their own country. But you, who are well educated and have travelled, cannot be unaware how hopeless is the struggle you have embarked upon, and how little any accidental success gained can affect the ultimate result." Kind of reminds me of George III in Hamilton. This had the exact opposite effect that Colley was aiming for. If there was one thing the Boers hated, it was being looked down on by a snooty British officer. This letter was excellent propaganda to stiffen the spines of the rebel army. Colley wouldn't even wait for a reply before marching on the neck, further deepening Boer suspicions of the British. Secondly, Colley was a very intelligent man. Of this there is no doubt. But intelligent men sometimes have strange ideas. While in India, Colley had maintained that, quote, 500 British men with breech loaders could ordinarily overcome any opposition, end quote. Through a mixture of chauvinism and arrogance, he seems to have believed that a smaller British force could always defeat a more numerous enemy. Thirdly, and this is just a personal theory of mine, I think his reputation as the brilliant strategist and most intelligent man in the army placed a massive psychological burden on Colley. Now he had a field command. Great things were expected of him. He almost felt like he had to attack. Otherwise, he would face criticism and loss of face. Lastly, historians have also raised the issue of Colley's much younger and socially ambitious wife. He had married Edith Hamilton, daughter of Colonel Meade Hamilton, one of the most warlike officers in the entire British Army. Edith herself was known throughout the service as Tiger, and was a formidable woman in her own right. Partly there is some sexism here, blaming the strong woman for pressuring her husband into making mistakes. But also it wouldn't be the first time that commander tried to impress his wife in battle. Napoleon's first Italian campaign is often seen as his best, and he was partly trying to show off to and impress Josephine. It's hard to believe that in Collie's mind there wasn't the urge of an older man trying to impress his younger wife. With all these factors pushing him forward, Collie decided not to wait for any reinforcements. He would attack straight away. His plan was relatively simple. He would shell the Boers into the ground with his artillery, then his infantry would smash through the rebel lines, supported by his small cavalry detachment. The Boers would flee, the war would be over, and he would be a hero. What could possibly go wrong? Just about everything. From Table Hill, you watch as the British prep their artillery for firing. An older Boer with a long white beard, who serves as your officer, announces, "Stay alert, especially you, young Jan," as he glares in your direction. Huffily, you reply back, "I fought at Bronkhorstspruit. I'm a veteran now." He glares back at you. "When you've been wounded 5 times and still ripped out a Zulu's throat with your teeth, then I'll call you a veteran." As he storms off, you ask the Boer next to you, "Did he really do that?" "God knows," he replies. "Beeman Kruger thinks he's crazy." The British guns roar. The battle has begun. Frantically, you race to the rear trench as your previous position explodes in clouds of dust. As the ground shakes, the old Boer smiles fiercely, and the light of battle is in his eyes. "When the barrage ends, the Roonecks will advance. You want to be a veteran, young Jan? Let's see how many you can kill." Suddenly, you can very much believe he ripped out a Zulu's throat with his teeth. The artillery bombardment that Collie had placed such hope in was a complete failure. The Boers just moved back to a rear trench that the British knew nothing about. It also didn't help that the bombardment was only 20 minutes long. It is still something of a mystery why it was so short. Likely, it was Collie's overconfidence. Not a single Boer was killed or wounded by the British artillery bombardment. Quite a record. The rebels just strolled back to their previous positions and waited. The mounted squadron, led by Major Brownlow and Sergeant Major Lunny, then made a series of huge mistakes. They were not the best cavalry unit in the Empire. Scratched together in a hurry, many barely knew how to ride a horse. They were meant to provide support to the infantry as they advanced. Instead, they jumped the gun and attacked prematurely. Brownlow then mistakenly veered away to the right and began galloping up the steepest part of the hill. By the time they reached the top, their poor horses were completely exhausted, leaving them vulnerable. A British journalist described what happened next. The moment they gained a level which exposed them to the view of the Boers on the summit of the hill, a terrible volley emptied half the saddles. Horses were galloping here and there. Those who remained mounted were staggered by his first reception, but manfully reformed, still under fire, and charged again. The hail of lead they were again met with was one that the weak force could not stand. Even now, there was a moment of epic heroism. Sergeant Major Lunny actually jumped into the enemy trenches, only to be killed by fire from 6 Boer marksmen. One of the last to go down was a Lieutenant Linmet. "I got up," he said, "and seeing no one about, I turned and legged it down the hill. My helmet had fallen off. My sword dropped out of my hand, and I lost my field glasses. It was a dashed expensive day. Got to love that British understatement. 17 riders were dead or wounded. 32 horses had been lost. The Boers had still not suffered a single casualty. As the cavalry was driven off, the 58th Regiment, the Northamptons, known proudly as the Steelbacks for their unflinching acceptance of flogging, began their attack. It was a historic moment, the end of an era. The last time red-coated British soldiers marched towards an enemy, carrying both their own and the Queen's colours. They were forced by their over-eager officers, who had a far easier trek on their horses, to ascend the steep slopes at an exhausting pace, made all the more difficult as the slope was covered in craters from the opening artillery bombardment. Struggling to remain together due to the craters, the sun also beat down on them with the full force of the morning heat. As they reached the top, they were exhausted, and they also realized their commander had made a horrific mistake. Colonel Dean, a staff officer of Colley's, who was leading the assault, had failed to give the order to his men to deploy right and left, spreading out before making the climb. They arrived at the crest of the hill, crowded together, an almost perfect target for the Boer sharpshooters. You're exhausted as you stagger to the top of the hill. Ahead, you see the Boers hunkered down in their trenches. Colonel Dean raises his sword and shouts, "Fix bayonets!" Then, "Charge!" All hell breaks loose as the Boers open up, their well-aimed shots cutting a swath through the ranks of red coats. The officers are the first to fall, riddled with bullets. Lieutenant Hughes, Colley's aide-de-camp, turns to a fellow officer and yells, "Come along, monk! Floretitona!" A Boer bullet smashes into his head, and he is killed instantly. You struggle forward, the ground covered in red-coated soldiers, dead or wounded. Colonel Dean's horse is hit and sprawls to the floor. Rising, he shouts, "I'm all right." Not for long, as a Boer slug hits him in the stomach and he keels over. There are no officers left. Instead, the sergeants are now being slaughtered. Still you march forward into the hail of lead. Now, you're close enough to the trenches to see a Boer taking aim at you. All of this really happened. To explain Lieutenant Yule's remark, both Monk and himself had been classmates at the highly prestigious private school Eton. Floret Etona is the school motto and means, "May Eton flourish." This moment became legendary and was commemorated in a famous Victorian painting by Lady Butler. The slow march against the Boer trench was a suicide mission, especially as with the cavalry neutralised, another Boer force began shooting them from the side as well. Even the colours were almost lost, if not for virtually a relay race of officers trying to save them. A Lieutenant Bailey had been carrying the regimental colours when he was struck down. Lieutenant Peel, carrying the Queen's colours, that's the Union Jack, offered his assistance. "Never mind me. Save the colours," the dying Bailey said. Peel moved down the hill with both colours when he fell into a large ant-hole. Of all the things. Sergeant Bridgestock seized the standards and took them to safety. A third lieutenant, named Hill, rushed back up the hill, picked up Bailey, and tried to carry him to safety. Bailey died in his arms. Hill rode his horse back up the hill again and again, seeking to rescue the wounded. He won the Victoria Cross for his bravery, and 2 of his horse's hooves ultimately were plated in silver and used as ashtrays by officers of the regiment. Finally, the Steelbacks could take no more. They fell back in disarray. 73 were dead and 100 wounded. The Boers now began to counterattack, as without the cavalry, there was now a huge gap in the British lines. With his forces mauled, Colley retreated, and the Boers chose not to follow. The British casualties were 84 killed, 113 wounded, and 2 captured. Colley had lost most of his staff officers. The Boer casualties were just 14 killed and 27 wounded. It had been a humiliating defeat, all the worse as it came at the hands of an enemy the British looked down on. Apart from my Sandalwanner, Laings Nek was the highest casualty toll for British regular troops in any earlier engagement in South Africa. Colley gathered together his battered army for a speech. "I wish everyone present to understand that the entire blame of today's repulse rests entirely upon me, and not on any of you. We have lost many gallant men, but we have not lost one atom of the prestige of England. We shall certainly take possession of the hill eventually, and I sincerely hope that all those men who have so nobly done their duty today will be with me then." This wouldn't be the last speech where he apologised for yet another bad defeat. Boer morale had never been higher. They had now defeated Britain in a proper pitched battle. The sky appeared to be the limit. As Colley waited for his reinforcements to arrive, they began attacking his supply lines. Soon, no supply wagons were making it to his base at Newcastle. Some of Colley's old arrogance still remained. He decided a show of force would stop these attacks on his supply lines. He took personal command of a column escorting some ambulances and mail wagons to Newcastle. It was normally a job for a major, but here was a British Major General escorting the mail with a column of 393 men and 4 cannon. Colley seems to have believed that there was no way the rebels would dare attack his personal convoy. He brought along his staff officers and personal friends for what he claimed would be a pleasant outing. So confident was Colley that he did not order either rations to be issued to the men or a water cart to accompany the column. Instead, he ordered a meal to be ready at 3:30 when the column would amble back to base. The convoy departed around 8:30 in the morning. Reaching the Ingogo River only a few miles from the camp, the British crossed at a low ford and began moving towards the high ground of the Schuanschucht Plateau. As the cavalry reached the plateau, shots rang out as they were ambushed by 100 Boers under the command of Nicholas Smit. The rest of Colley's force raced to defend the cavalry, preparing to fire their cannons. The cannons were the main reason Colley was so overconfident about this journey. Boers feared the British artillery, and as the cannons fired, the rebels predictably scattered and sought cover. So far, so good. But Colley thought the Boers would now flee. They didn't. Instead, They began to advance on the British position, using the tall grass and numerous boulders for cover. Relentlessly sniping at the British, casualties soon started to mount for Colley's force. In particular, they targeted the gunners firing the cannons, as we saw in this episode's opening scene. Every time the gunners had to prepare the cannons to fire again, they were pelted with bullets by the Boers. Soon, most of them were dead or injured, and the farmers had achieved the only instance of rifle fire putting cannons out of action. A desperate Colley ordered Major Brownlow to lead his cavalry in an attack on the Boers' right flank, where most of the gunfire seemed to be coming from. Brownlow led out his men, but before he could give the order to charge, a huge volley of Boer gunfire killed virtually all their horses. The enthusiastic, but always unsuccessful Brownlow led his men back to the plateau on foot. The British were now in real danger. The sun was baking the plateau, and they had run out of water. Colley had thought that this would be a jaunt in the South African countryside, so he hadn't bothered to bring a water cart. "Not necessary," he said. "What are the chances of us being surrounded by the Boers and needing water?" He was regretting that now. One by one, they were being picked off by Boer snipers. The camp was filled with wounded, begging for water. A force of 70 British soldiers was sent to attack the Boers, but was annihilated by nightfall, all of them dead or wounded. It was later revealed that it was just 3 Boers who achieved this, with just their rifles and expert use of the terrain. Ironically, the weather saved the convoy from destruction. The heavens opened, and the Boers decided they wanted to go home rather than get wet. A frustrated Smith agreed, assuming they could finish off the British the next day. It was the only Boer mistake of the whole war. Colley's convoy escaped under the cloak of night. Colley tried to claim that Ingogo was a victory, or at least a stalemate. But the numbers spoke for themselves. 66 men had been killed and 67 wounded. The Boers had suffered just 10 dead and 6 wounded. British marksmanship was really poor throughout this conflict. In just 2 battles, Colley had lost over 300 men. His army was only about 1,400 strong. Even worse, he had lost almost all of his staff officers. Only his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Bruce Hamilton, and Major Edmund Essex remained. Essex in particular had earned the nickname Lucky. He had somehow survived Isandlwana, Laings Nek, and now Ingogo. While Colley once again made a speech accepting responsibility for yet another defeat, this time he was met by grumbling from his men. They were losing faith in him, questioning whether this great armchair general could actually cut the mustard in the field. One soldier wrote in his diary that, quote, "He was a great hand at making speeches and writing dispatches, and a more charming and courteous man you could not meet. I heard one old officer, who had seen considerable service, say after the Battle of Ingogo that Colley ought not to be trusted with a corporal's guard on active service. It is an extraordinary thing that he has made such a mess of it." End quote. Colley now began to crack under the pressure, traumatized by the loss of so many of his men, fellow officers and friends. He became obsessed with personal redemption. After Ingogo, he hardly slept at all, instead writing endless letters to his wife in his tent half the night. An unidentified officer told a reporter from the Town Mercury that, quote, "Another defeat will kill Colley," end quote. These were prophetic words. While the battered British army waits for reinforcements, let's head to the garrisons in the Transvaal, who are still under siege with no chance of rescue for the moment. At Rustenburg, most of the garrison had been withdrawn before everything went to hell. Just 62 men were left behind when 600 Boers surrounded them. Refusing to surrender, a stalemate set in, as the Boers didn't know how to take fortified positions. Little food or water had been stored at the garrison before the siege. Even with extreme rationing, they were beginning to run short. Then a miracle seemed to happen. Clouds darkened the sky, and the heavens opened. The British soldiers had all the water they could drink. It rained, and it rained, and it rained. It would rain non-stop for 45 days out of a 93-day siege. Their trenches flooded, the hospital flooded, the outhouses flooded, and their unsavoury contents were soon swamping the camp. Needless to say, diarrhea and cholera were soon running rampant for this poor group of men. When the miracle rain finally ended, the British were briefly happy until they realised the Boers had dug a trench right next to the fort. All the easier now for the marksmen to pick off the redcoats. The British commander, Captain Auchinleck, found this out when they shot him in the jaw. However, Auchinleck also turned out to be one of the toughest men to ever wear the red coat. It helped that he was Scottish, a hardier people I have yet to meet. He didn't go to the hospital to recover, though admittedly it was now a flooded plague pit. Instead, once his jaw was bandaged, he led a nighttime commando raid on the Boer trench. In doing so, Auchinleck was shot 3 more times, and amazingly he survived. They just don't make soldiers like this anymore. When the war ended and the garrison was allowed to leave, they had suffered relatively few casualties, apart from the poor Auchinleck. Next to come under siege was Standerton, situated midway on the road between Newcastle and Pretoria. This is the garrison Colley would have tried to relieve first, if Laings Nek hadn't turned into a bloody disaster. The garrison survived through a mixture of raiding and ambushing the Boers, something they were so good at, in fact, that a bunch of drunken British soldiers decided to take it a step further. I'll let the regimental history tell this hilarious story. One night, a drunken sergeant, believed to refer to Colour Sergeant Conway of the 58th Regiment, and 5 of his comrades, boasted that they could catch a standard cop. They stumbled up the slope to a place near the top and seized a post, which the Boers left unoccupied after dark. When the unsuspecting Boers returned in the morning, the 6 opened fire. The fire was returned, of course, and the sergeant and his men quickly sobered up when they saw the seriousness of their position. Major Montague had to stage a diversion to bring them down safely to the fort. With the normal mixture of formality and practicality of British military justice, Sergeant Conway and his drunken comrades were sentenced to imprisonment. But as they were surrounded by Boers and couldn't spare the men, he was soon back on the front lines. To be fair, his drunken stunt was probably great for the morale of the garrison. In the end, the besieged suffered 5 dead and 6 wounded, and survived an 88-day siege. Lastly, we'll take a look at Lydenburg. This was the garrison the ill-fated Anstruve and his men had come from. Thanks to the disaster at Bronkhorstbrut, there were just 50 soldiers left under the command of Lieutenant William Long to defend the fort. This tiny force faced 600 Boers. Long refused to surrender, and the Boers repeatedly tried to fight their way inside. They even used cannon they had captured from the British to bombard them. While they were expert shots with a rifle, artillery was a different matter. The shells passed harmlessly overhead as they couldn't get the range right. Despite being so outnumbered, the besieged redcoats launched numerous raids, which caused chaos among the Boers. You crawl slowly through the grass, every muscle on your body tensed, trying not to make a sound. Behind you are 2 other British soldiers. In front are the circled wagons of the Boers, the famous defensive lagers that they use. You're part of a nighttime raid to keep them off balance. You're close to the wagons when a twig cracks under your hand. Silently you swear and freeze in place. A Boer sentry appears, raises his rifle, and stares out into the gloom. Your heart pounds and you pray to God, waiting for a gunshot. But the Boer doesn't fire. Instead he lowers his rifle and disappears. That was too close. Now you're within range. You all prep your homemade firebombs. Then, with a mighty heave, you throw them onto the wagons in the middle of the lager. Panic breaks out as the flames erupt and the terrified livestock begin to stampede. Many sleeping Boers are trampled to death. Others struggle between putting out the flaming wagons and calming the animals. Neither task is going well. Pleased with your night's work, the 3 of you fade back into the gloom. After an 84-day siege, the garrison lost only 4 men and 19 injured. While the garrison stood firm, Collie was nowhere near to relieving them. Traumatized, despondent, and desperate, he began to crack under the pressure. Soon, a crazy plan began to form in his increasingly broken mind. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a review, or tell a friend. In our next episode, an increasingly unhinged Collie makes a desperate gamble for redemption. What follows is the worst British defeat of the whole war, the Battle of Majuba Hill. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.